Before there was fire, there was clay. Heavy, stubborn agricultural clay. The kind that swallowed plows and drowned harvests. The kind that told men, not here, not this. And so, in a shallow valley in the heart of England, in the year 1086, when the Great Domesday Survey catalogued every manor worth taxing, the settlement called Birmingham warranted only a single line: 9 households. A hamlet so inconsequential that the king's accountants barely troubled their ink. It had begun, centuries earlier, as the home of a Saxon chieftain's people, Bjorma's people, Birmingham, a clearing in the Midland forest, nothing more. No river wide enough to float a barge, no fertile plains, no Roman road, just clay, and the kind of men who had nowhere else to go. This, as it would turn out, was the greatest gift the earth could give them. In 1166, a lord named Peter de Birmingham rode to the court of King Henry II and obtained a charter. Every Thursday, from that day forward, a market would be held. People would come, goods would change hands, and the landless, the dispossessed, the men who could not farm this punishing soil, they would find another way to earn. They picked up iron, they learned the hammer. By the 13th century, there were knife makers here, nailers, lorimers, craftsmen who shaped the metal fittings of a horse's bridle. Small, precise, relentless work that asked nothing of a river or a field. Work that only asked for fire and hands and the Thursday market to sell it. The clay had not broken them, it had forged them. Then came a war. In the 1640s, England tore itself apart between a king who believed in divine right and a parliament that believed in something else entirely. Birmingham had long since chosen its side. Its smiths were Puritan, stubborn, and quietly furious. While the royalist armies held the great arsenals of the kingdom, they lacked the workshops of the Midlands. Birmingham supplied Parliament. More than 15,000 sword blades, forged here, noted even by enemies as superior to London's work, produced faster and cheaper. Pikes, gun parts, iron shot, deliberately, specifically, only for Parliament. The town refused on principle to arm the king. On the 3rd of April, 1643, Prince Rupert arrived to collect the debt. His cavalry burned approximately 80 houses. They looted, they killed. The town, which could not have stopped them, resisted anyway, had already harassed the king's baggage train on its march south, had made itself a target through sheer defiant stubbornness. When the smoke cleared, Birmingham was poorer and its character was permanently set. A place that preferred destruction over submission. A place that understood, in its bones, that independence was not a luxury. It was an industrial requirement. By 1690, perhaps 7,000 people lived here. The town called itself, and was called by others, the toy shop of Europe, not toys for children. The word meant something else then. Buckles, buttons, snuff boxes, watch chains, sword hilts. The intricate, glittering small metalwork that dressed the fashionable bodies of Europe's elite. Birmingham goods, they were sometimes called, with a sneer. Cheap, imitation. But the word contained a deeper truth, that this place had learned to make almost anything, faster and cheaper than anywhere else, and the world was already paying attention. There was one more gift the earth had given Birmingham. Every empire, every war, every invention that changed the shape of human life. History is not a story, it is a record, and records deserve to be kept without distortion, without agenda, without myth dressed as fact. If Kurzgesagt is for broad education, this channel is for factual history. This is the History Project, the most rigorously factual history on YouTube. If that matters to you, subscribe, support the project. Every subscriber makes it possible to keep building this archive, one verified fact at a time. One that no one had planned. The town had never received a borough charter. It had no municipal corporation, no guild system with its jealous monopolies and its licensing fees and its closed doors. Other English cities strangled their industries with such structures. Birmingham, by accident of its obscure origins, had none of it. Any man could set up any trade. Any immigrant could bring any skill. Any idea could be tested without permission. In retrospect, the absence of a charter was not a disadvantage. It was a prophecy. In 1662, the English crown passed the Act of Uniformity. Nearly 2,000 Protestant ministers who refused to conform to the Church of England were expelled, stripped of their pulpits, their livelihoods, their futures. They had to go somewhere. Birmingham, because it was a manor and not a corporation, was not bound by the rules that silenced them elsewhere. The 5 Mile Act, which forbade ejected ministers from living or preaching within 5 miles of any incorporated town, did not apply here, and so they came. Presbyterians, Quakers, Independents, Unitarians, educated men, often brilliant, carrying ideas that the established order had decided were dangerous. They built their meeting houses, they opened their academies, they taught natural philosophy, mathematics, rhetoric, and radical theology to generations of Birmingham children, a curriculum no Anglican grammar school would have permitted. This was the invisible infrastructure of what was coming. Not iron, not coal, ideas. In 1762, a man named Matthew Boulton began building something on the edge of town, beside Hockley Brook. He called it the Soho Manufactory. When it was completed in 1765, it was unlike anything the world had seen. The principle was not new. Men had long understood that a task done repeatedly, by a hand trained to do nothing else, is done faster and better than a task done by a generalist. But no one had applied it at this scale, to this breadth of goods, under one roof, with this degree of systematic design, drawing, modeling, casting, chasing, gilding, finishing, all of it centralized. The watermill of Hockley Brook drove the machinery. 600 workers, eventually more than 1,000, moved through the complex in a flow as choreographed as a river. A decade before Adam Smith published his theory of the division of labor, Matthew Boulton was practicing it. What Soho made was beautiful. Ormolu, gilded bronze vases, candelabras, perfume burners, intended to challenge the French dominance in luxury goods. Sheffield plate, which laminated silver onto copper and placed silver-quality tableware within reach of the prosperous middle class. Coins, medals, buttons. The manufactory received visitors from across Europe who came simply to witness what organized production could produce. But the most important thing Soho made was a partnership. James Watt was a Scottish instrument maker with a problem he could not stop thinking about. A Newcomen steam engine, the only steam engine that existed, wasted nearly all the fuel it consumed. To create a vacuum, it injected cold water into the working cylinder to condense the steam, but this cooled the cylinder itself, and then the next stroke of steam had to reheat that massive chamber before it could do any work at all. Over and over, heat applied, heat destroyed, energy consumed in an endless, futile cycle. Watt understood the thermodynamic principle precisely. The cylinder must remain as hot as possible, while the steam must condense somewhere as cold as possible. His 1769 patent described the solution: a separate condenser, a secondary chamber kept permanently cold, connected to the main cylinder, which was now free to stay permanently hot. The result was an engine that used roughly a quarter of the fuel of its predecessor. The idea was correct. The money and the manufacturing capacity to realize it were, for years, absent. Then Matthew Boulton wrote him a letter, and in 1775, an Act of Parliament extended Watt's patent to the year 1800, giving the partnership, Boulton and Watt, 25 years to commercialize the engine before any competitor could touch it. Why here? Why Birmingham? Because nowhere else had the precision metalworkers who could hold tolerances fine enough to make the engine's cylinders function. Because nowhere else had the culture of practical experimentation that Soho embodied. Because Boulton understood markets and Watt understood physics, and Birmingham was the only place in the world where those two things had learned to speak the same language. He came to Birmingham in 1780, Joseph Priestley, Unitarian minister, amateur scientist, and the most intellectually restless man in England. He had already, almost accidentally, discovered that water could be infused with carbon dioxide gas. Carbonated water, the Royal Navy briefly believed it might prevent scurvy. He had isolated oxygen, though he never entirely accepted what he had found. He was prolific, generous, argumentative, and constitutionally incapable of keeping dangerous opinions to himself. In 1790 and 791, he published pamphlets defending the French Revolution. He attacked the Church of England. He used the metaphor, reckless, vivid, unforgettable, of laying gunpowder under the old religious and political establishment. He became known as Gunpowder Priestley. On the 14th of July, 1791, a group of loyalists gathered in Birmingham to celebrate the second anniversary of the storming of the Bastille. Priestley was not there. He did not need to be. His name was enough. The mob moved through the city for 4 days. They burned the new meeting house where Priestley had preached, and the old meeting house beside it. They came for his home at Fair Hill, looted it, razed it. His laboratory, one of the finest private scientific facilities in Europe, was destroyed. His library, years of unpublished manuscripts. Some rioters, it was reported, tried to carry away fire from his great electrical machine. Priestley escaped with his life. He moved to London. In 1794, he sailed for America and never returned. Birmingham had consumed one of its own finest minds, but it had not changed what it was: the Lunar Society. Boulton, Watt, Priestley, Erasmus Darwin, Josiah Wedgwood, and the others had already met for 30 years, had already asked every question that the coming century would be forced to answer. The ideas were loose in the world now. The fire had been lit. In 1769, before the steam engine had changed anything, before Napoleon existed, before the word industrialization had been coined, Birmingham opened a canal. It cut through clay and limestone to reach the Black Country coal fields that lay just to the west. On the day it opened, the price of coal in Birmingham fell by half. This was the beginning of something that would, in its final form, be spoken of with a kind of wonder. The Birmingham Canal navigations grew to encompass more than 150 miles of waterway within a 12-mile radius of the city. More canals, it was said, than Venice. Gas lamps lit the locks so that boats could move through the night. A single horse pulling an arrowboat on still water could move 25 to 30 tons, more than 150 times the load the same animal could carry on its back along a road. Coal flowed in, iron flowed in, limestone, clay, timber, bricks, guns, jewelry, finished ironwork flowed out, south to Bristol and north to Liverpool, and from there to every market the British Empire had opened. The Gas Street Basin sat at the center, the beating heart of a circulatory system that fed, and was fed by, the largest concentration of manufacturing industry the world had ever assembled. In the gun quarter around St. Mary's Row, another kind of production had reached its industrial apogee. When Napoleon's wars began in earnest in 1803, the British Army needed muskets. It needed them in numbers that no single royal arsenal could supply. Birmingham's gunmakers, the Galtons, the Ketlins, the hundreds of component specialists who each made a lock, a stock, a barrel, and passed it down the chain, answered the call. Between 1804 and 1807, Birmingham delivered more than 1.8 million muskets, rifles, carbines, and pistols to the British government. Roughly 1 million more items went to the East India Company. At peak production, the quarter was turning out thousands of weapons per week. 2/3 of all small arms used by the British Army in the Napoleonic Wars had been made here, in a city that held no royal warrant, operated no official arsenal, and had started as a hamlet too small for the Doomsday Census to care about. In 1813, the Birmingham Proof House was established, one of the first systematic quality control mechanisms in industrial history. Every barrel was tested before it left the city. The proof mark stamped into the metal was a guarantee from an entire manufacturing system that the thing would not kill the man who fired it. What had happened here across 200 years was not an accident, or rather it was a particular kind of accident. The kind that requires, in precise combination, the right soil, the right absence of rules, the right congregation of dissenters, the right pair of men meeting at the right moment, and a population that had learned, generation by generation, that the only thing standing between them and ruin was the quality of what their hands could make. The clay had not broken them. The absence of a charter had not weakened them. The riots, the raids, the expelled ministers, the burned houses, none of it had broken the underlying current. Birmingham became the workshop of the world not because it was given anything. It became the workshop of the world because it was given almost nothing, and it made of that almost nothing a civilization. The smoke rose, the hammers fell, and the modern world, in all its terrifying abundance, was beaten into shape here, in a valley of clay in the middle of England, where a market had been held on Thursdays since the year 1166.